respect the enemy and only to attack those people who were fighting, not to attack and to ill-treat non-combatants. And that is a purity of arms. It's a moral philosophy that continues to exist in the British Army as well, of course, as in the Israeli Army to this very day. So if that's the case, why are there so many criticisms? Why are there so many questions about what the IDF do and how the IDF conduct themselves? You only have to think back to 2009, when the distinguished Judge Goldstone made his comments alleging that the IDF deliberately targeted and killed women and children and innocent civilians during Operation Cast Lead in Gaza. You can look further, you can look closer to today, when the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, in November, just gone, during Operation Pillar of Defense, said, IDF attacks affecting schools and religious sites, as well as the reported targeting of homes and media outlets, raise serious concerns about Israel's commitment to its obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. He's wrong, ladies and gentlemen. They don't raise any such concerns. I was there at the time in Israel and on the borders with Gaza throughout Operation Pillar of Defense. I watched what happened, I saw what happened, and the head of the UN Human Rights Council was mistaken in his comments. I was at Ashkelon, Ashdod and Sderot, and I watched that amazing miracle of Israeli military technology smash down from the sky many Palestinian rockets headed to Israeli cities and villages. And because of that technology, in which so much expertise was invested, Israel was able to protect its people without having to go in on the ground into Gaza, which would have caused vast amount of bloodshed. The investment in that technology and the development of that technology itself, I think, says a huge amount for the priorities placed by the Israeli government and the IDF on protecting their own people while at the same time not attacking, unnecessarily causing civilian casualties. During that campaign, there were vast numbers of warnings issued to the people in Gaza who were occupying sites that were being used by Palestinian extremists for their attacks. Emails, phone calls, radio messages, leaflets, thousands of leaflets dropped warning people when an area was going to be attacked so they could out. The Israelis have even developed, and they developed it during Operation Cast Lead but used it in November last year, developed a missile that's specifically designed to explode harmlessly on a building, to give a warning to people that that's about to be hit by the real thing. Every single airstrike during Operation Pillar of Defense in November last year had to be personally authorized by the chief of the Israeli Air Force or one of his two deputies sitting in the operations center before the actual missile could be released onto the target. Personally authorized. Ladies and gentlemen, I will tell you now, I've been in the army for 30 years. No other country would put so much effort in, expend so many resources and take so much care to minimize civilian casualties in the combat zone. The figures speak for themselves as well. It's not just my opinion. The facts support what I say, even though they're not necessarily taken much notice of. There's been a great emphasis on the disparity between Israeli deaths in combat and Palestinian deaths in that conflict. Israeli all deaths and all Palestinian deaths. And people have argued that because there were more Palestinians killed than Israelis, the Israelis were committing war crimes. Ladies and gentlemen, that of course is utter nonsense and completely irrelevant to any concept of the law of armed conflict. One more useful figure that is actually relevant is the proportion of civilian to military deaths in a conflict. And the reason it's relevant is because if a high proportion of civilians are killed compared to the number of military killed, it can indicate excessive use of force and lack of care in targeting. According to United Nations statistics, in this type of conflict since the Second World War, for every single fighter killed, 3 civilians are killed, on average, in this type of conflict. In some, for example, in Chechnya and in some parts of Iraq, 5 civilians have been killed for every fighter killed. In Operation Cast Lead in 2009, in Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, last year, the figure was less than 1 civilian killed for every fighter. That is less than 1/3 of the average number of civilians killed in combat. Now that speaks entirely for itself, but of course it is completely ignored, and Israel is held to different standards to the rest of the world. It's ignored by academics, by universities, by human rights groups, by the media, and by the United Nations. Now your organizations here, your spiritual guide, who was mentioned earlier, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, called the UN a house of lies. Now we know how great a spiritual and intellectual insight the rabbi had, and no more in any situation than in an insight into the United Nations. He had a very strong point. In 2012, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a total of 22 resolutions singling out Israel for criticism. In the same period, the General Assembly adopted just 4 resolutions for the rest of the world combined. 22 for Israel, 4 for the world. 1 each for Syria, Iran, North Korea, and Burma. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, a house of lies is an apt description. Israel is the only country in the world that has had its right to exist constantly challenged. I would never try to argue that Israel has the right to exist. I would never argue that, any more than I would argue that Great Britain has a right to exist, the United States has a right to exist, or actually France. That's a good question. Thank you and apologies. I mean, I will make a simple assertion. Israel does have the right to exist. And if Israel has the right to exist, Israel also has the right to defend itself. And again, that great religious leader, Rabbi Schneerson, rightly said, and I quote from him, "Jewish law sets forth the criteria necessary for Israel's peace and safety. These can only be achieved from a position of military strength and secure borders." Well, ladies and gentlemen, despite the undoubted military strength of the Israeli Defense Forces, which is an admirable military organization, admired, I can tell you now, by the vast majority of members of the British Army, despite its strength and despite the strength of the nation of Israel, it still needs strong support from its international friends. Israel, as I've suggested earlier, is a strong friend and ally to Britain and to the Western world. I mentioned a couple of examples from my personal experience. And actually, as we're sitting here tonight enjoying this wonderful dinner, and I have to say that I've enjoyed many kosher dinners in the past, but this is probably one of the finest I've eaten, so thank you very much to the rabbis. As we sit here tonight, British soldiers' lives are being saved in Afghanistan by Israeli military technology, technology designed to counter improvised explosive devices, and Israeli medical technology as well. We all know how superb Israel is at developing high-tech and developing some of the most advanced scientific breakthroughs. Well, battlefield medical technology is something that they are very expert in, and it, as I say, is saving British lives tonight. But the more momentum that this, what I describe as an international conspiracy against Israel, and actually what it is in many ways is Israel has become, this is not the total reason for it, but it's partial reason, Israel has become a proxy for anti-Semitism. And the more that conspiracy gathers, the less it's challenged, the more it will undermine Israel, and also the more it will undermine our country and the Western world. Goldstone, in 2009, announced in his report, which was endorsed by the vast majority of members of the United Nations, that to attack and to kill or to attack an enemy among a civilian population is illegal, is unlawful. Those were his words, that was his decision. This decision was echoed in the UN Secretary General's words during Operation Pillar of Defence when he said, speaking of Israeli action, the loss of civilian lives is unacceptable under any circumstances. He went on to say that the excessive use of force is unlawful and must be rejected. And he was wrong. He was wrong to say the loss of civilian lives is unacceptable under any circumstances. The laws of war disagree with him. He was wrong to categorize Israeli force as excessive use of military force. And the attempt to portray every single military action by Israel as unlawful and a war crime is a part of this whole conspiracy. And these sentiments, especially as they're factually inaccurate, encourage terrorist organizations to hide behind civilian populations. They encourage the use of human shields, because if people like the UN Secretary General, if Judge Goldstone is saying that you can't attack them when they're hiding behind civilians, then why wouldn't you? And that's exactly why they try and do it in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and in Mali today. Iran, whose nuclear ambitions represent the greatest single threat to Israel and to the world, is desperate to divide us, to divide the West and Israel, to divide and conquer, and is working extremely hard to do so. It's essential that we in this country do not allow ourselves to be divided by mendacious distortions that focus on false accusations of Israel's abuse of human rights and disregard of the laws of war. To use the overworn phrase, but in this case I think a very apt phrase, that can't be repeated in this context too often, we are in this together, facing the same threat of global violent jihad. And we in this country must stand with Israel in this fight. I understand the pressures on our national leaders, from both at home and from abroad. But in this issue, the highest interests are at stake. As Churchill knew in the 1930s, now is not the time for continued appeasement. It's not the time for moral cowardice. It's the time for heroism. And I know this organization here is not a political group, but I also know that by the nature of this organization, that yourselves can play, either individually or collectively, a significant role in standing alongside Israel and combating this threat. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.